Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, something slow. The kind of story that smells faintly of damp stone, forgotten corridors, and old ghosts that don't even bother to haunt anymore because, frankly, they're just tired, so dim the lights, get cozy. Maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm, preferably without caffeine unless you're into chaos. Because tonight we're going on a little stroll, a very slow, very quiet stroll with Mr. Pebble. Now, Mr. Pebble isn't exactly famous. In fact, no one really remembers him at all, which is kind of the point. He's the sort of man history tends to lose under the furniture, the kind who was technically there during important events, but never made it into the paintings. But still, he was there, watching, shuffling quietly through the centuries like an overlooked footnote in a dusty book. They called him Mister Pebble, not because that was his real name. No, his name was something much longer, German, and unnecessarily filled with consonants, but because he had this particular way of walking, softly, carefully, as if each footstep was apologizing for existing. His shoes, polished but always a little scuffed at the edges, would make this tiny crunching sound on gravel, hence Mr. Pebble. He was born somewhere near the Rhine River around 1728, in one of those miniature principalities that had a name longer than the country itself. Technically, it was called the Duchy of Hohenlichtenberg an der Schloss, but even the locals just shrugged and called it home. His father was a minor noble, a man who owned more wigs than land, and his mother was, predictably, a distant cousin. Because, of course, she was. You see, back then, inbreeding wasn't just a royal hobby. It was practically an art form. Families would carefully marry their children off to each other like they were trading cards, convinced that keeping the bloodline pure was the key to stability. Spoiler, it wasn't. What it was, however, was an excellent way to ensure that your descendants had jawlines you could cut bread with, but not open wide enough to eat it. Mr. Pebble was one of those descendants. He came into the world with a faintly lopsided face, mild asthma, and a temperament so gentle it could be mistaken for sleepwalking. He spent most of his childhood indoors, staring out of fogged-up windows at the gray gardens of his family's half-collapsed manor. His tutors said he was thoughtful, which in aristocratic terms meant slow, but polite about it. His older brother Ernst Ludwig got all the attention because Ernst Ludwig was supposed to inherit everything. And by everything, I mean about 12 square kilometers of woodland, a crumbling castle, and a ceremonial title that sounded far fancier than it was. Meanwhile, Mr. Pebble, or Friedrich Wilhelm Johann Leopold von Hohenlichtenberg, if you wanted to be formal about it, was destined for the usual aristocratic plan B, the church. Which was funny, because Friedrich wasn't particularly religious. He wasn't even particularly interested in anything. He was one of those people who found deep comfort in routine, walking the same path every day, reading the same book every week, and polishing the same brass buttons until they gleamed like small suns. And yet, it was that quiet routine that made him something of a legend among the servants. They'd whisper, "The young master walks again," whenever they saw him drift out after sunset, coat buttoned, hair tied neatly back, carrying a small walking stick that he never actually used. He would circle the estate slowly, always counterclockwise, for reasons no one ever asked about, and pause by the old well. Sometimes he'd drop in a pebble, just one. No one knew why. Let's float gently forward to the year 1756. Europe, as usual, was at war with itself. The 7 Years' War was about to turn the continent into a chaotic, muddy chessboard of alliances, betrayals, and really bad cartography. Friedrich's older brother, Ernst Ludwig, decided to do what all moderately ambitious, moderately foolish noblemen did at the time. He joined the army. He rode off in a blaze of self-importance, declaring he would bring honor to their family name. He returned 6 months later with a limp half a mustache and a deep resentment for anything involving horses. So naturally, their father decided Mr. Pebble would take his place next time. Except Mr. Pebble had other plans. Which is to say, no plans. He simply didn't go. When the messenger arrived with the enlistment papers, Friedrich politely thanked him, made tea, and went for a walk. By the time anyone noticed he hadn't shown up for military duty, 2 months had passed, and his father had died of what the local doctor diplomatically called chronic disappointment. Ernst Ludwig became Duke, of course. He immediately raised taxes, fired half the staff, and began hosting elaborate dinner parties to impress neighboring nobles, most of whom didn't even like him. Friedrich, meanwhile, inherited nothing but a small stipend, a creaky hunting cottage on the edge of the estate, and the family's least stable horse. He moved in quietly, hung a single portrait on the wall, a faded image of his mother, and started his evening walks again. Only now, he added a new habit, talking to the pebbles. People began to notice. Servants, woodcutters, even the occasional traveling merchant would glimpse him wandering down the path, murmuring to himself in the dim light. "Good evening," he would say softly, tipping his hat to the air. "A lovely night for reflection, isn't it?" And then he'd stoop down, pick up a small stone, and roll it between his fingers as if it were alive. When asked, and only one brave, stable hand ever did ask, what he was doing, Friedrich smiled vaguely and said, "Listening." Now, in fairness, this was the 18th century. People were into all kinds of mystical nonsense. Seances, phrenology, powdered wigs, take your pick. But even by those standards, a lonely nobleman talking to rocks was a bit much. Rumors began to swirl that the young von Hohenlichtenberg had gone mad, that the family curse, because of course there was one, had finally claimed him. Some said he'd been cursed by an old governess he'd once offended by rearranging her spoons. Others insisted it was divine punishment for his refusal to join the war. But Mr. Pebble didn't seem particularly cursed. He was, if anything, serenely content. He ate modestly, wrote occasional letters to his brother, who never wrote back, and spent most evenings strolling under the moonlight, whispering to his stones. He had a particular favorite, a small, smooth piece of white quartz he found near the riverbank one summer. He named it Herr Weiss. He carried it everywhere, even to bed. It was during one of these walks that he first met Countess Amalia von Grunewald. Ah, Amalia. If Friedrich was a whisper, she was a sigh, elegant, pale, and perpetually bored. She'd been married off at 16 to a man 20 years older, who, inconveniently, didn't die fast enough for her liking. By the time she met Mr. Pebble, she was 29, widowed, and in possession of 3 estates, 2 carriages, and absolutely no hobbies. Their meeting wasn't particularly romantic. In fact, it was raining. Friedrich was out on his usual evening route, hat pulled low, cloak damp, when Amalia's carriage broke a wheel near the Old Oak Road. He offered her shelter in his cottage, which she accepted mostly because she had no other choice. While the servants fixed the wheel, the two of them sat by the fire, sipping thin tea and discussing the weather in that vague, aristocratic way that implies mutual disinterest. But then, something shifted. She noticed his calm, the slow, deliberate way he spoke, the lack of pretense. He noticed her hands, pale, elegant, restless, and just like that, a quiet companionship began. Amalia started visiting the cottage under the pretense of checking the estate boundaries. Friedrich, ever polite, would invite her in for tea. They'd talk about books, clouds, and occasionally, politics, though only in the most uncommitted, drowsy way possible. At some point, she noticed the small stones lined neatly on his windowsill. "Are those your friends?" she asked once, amused. He smiled faintly. "They listen better than most people." She laughed, softly, not mockingly. And after that, she began bringing him little pebbles from her travels. Smooth river stones, bits of marble, even a chipped mosaic piece from an old fountain. He arranged them carefully in rows, naming each one after a virtue: patience, memory, silence, forgiveness. And somehow, over time, the lonely nobleman and the bored widow found a kind of peace together. But of course, peace never lasts long in aristocratic circles. Especially when inheritance is involved. Ernst Ludwig, Mr. Pebble's ever-resentful brother, had managed to bankrupt most of the duchy through bad investments and worse dinners. When he finally died, dramatically choking on a piece of roast goose, the family line was in trouble. The family line was in trouble. Friedrich, as the last surviving male relative, was suddenly next in line, which would have been fine. Except no one could actually find him. When the royal messengers arrived at his cottage, they found the door open, tea still warm, and the faint scent of damp earth in the air. On the table was a letter addressed simply to the world. Inside, in neat, careful handwriting, were the words, "Everything heavy falls eventually. I will walk until I am light, enough to be forgotten." He was never seen again. Some say he drowned himself in the Rhine. Others claim he moved to Italy under a false name and became a painter of quiet landscapes, always featuring small, round stones in the corners. But those who lived near the estate swore that on calm nights, you could still hear the faint crunch of gravel along the old path, as if someone, somewhere, was still walking. So that's Mr. Pebble. A man who didn't fight wars, write manifestos, or make grand speeches. Just a quiet walker with a pocket full of stones and a remarkable talent for vanishing gracefully. And maybe that's all right. Not every story needs a grand ending. Some just fade like footsteps in the dark. Now, if you're still awake, first, congratulations. But we're not done yet. Let's float onward gently into another forgotten corner of history. Another life that drifted quietly between importance and obscurity, because Mr. Pebble may have vanished. But Europe was full of people just like him, soft ghosts wandering through centuries of noise. So take a breath. Adjust your pillow, all right. Still here, cozy? Blanket situation good? Good. Because now we're gliding softly into another quiet pocket of history. A place where the chandeliers were too heavy, the wigs too tall, and the silence almost sacred. Our next subject was not a walker like Mr. Pebble. He preferred stillness, complete, unbothered stillness. Meet Charles of Württemberg, better known to the handful of people who dared talk about him as the Silent Duke. He ruled, technically, between 1772 and 1793. I say technically because ruled implies effort, and effort was something Charles was spectacularly uninterested in. He was born into comfort, surrounded by powdered tutors, mechanical clocks, and a mother who believed in astrology more than childcare. His father died early, a hunting accident involving a startled boar and what we'll generously call misplaced confidence. So Charles became Duke at 19, a prime age for doing something stupid. But unlike his peers who drank, gambled, and declared unnecessary wars, Charles did nothing, absolutely nothing, for weeks, months, eventually years. And people noticed. The first sign that something was off came during his coronation banquet. While other dukes had elaborate speeches written for them, full of divine right nonsense and vague promises about prosperity, Charles simply stood up, raised his glass, and said nothing. He just looked at the crowd, slowly, calmly, one by one. Then he sat down again. The room waited. There was a confused cough, a dropped fork. Then the orchestra awkwardly started playing early, and that was it. His entire coronation speech lasted exactly 0 seconds. Some said it was brilliant minimalism. Others thought he'd forgotten the words. The truth? He simply didn't feel like talking. Charles lived most of his days inside the ducal palace of Stuttgart, a sprawling complex of echoing halls, imported marble, and approximately 43 unnecessary staircases. He filled it with silence. Meetings with advisors, conducted through handwritten notes, family dinners, muted nods, royal decrees, short, almost poetic fragments. One famous decree simply read, "Let the gardens grow wild." No explanation, no context. Just that, and so they did. Within a few years, the perfectly trimmed French-style gardens became a tangle of ivy, roses, and untamed grass. The court gardeners were horrified, of course, but the Duke merely observed them, expressionless, as if daring anyone to suggest pruning. No one did. He wasn't cruel, just distant. Detached in that soft, ghostly way people get when they've decided the world doesn't deserve their voice. He'd attend council meetings only to stare out the window while ministers argued about grain prices. When the noise got too loud, he'd calmly stand up, bow faintly, and leave, sometimes in the middle of sentences. He became a myth among diplomats. Foreign envoys dreaded being sent to Württemberg because negotiating with Charles felt like talking to an expensive statue. One Prussian ambassador described him as a man sculpted from melancholy, marble. Another, less poetically, called him a bored cat in a crown. Now, before we judge him too harshly, it's worth remembering that this was the late 18th century, Europe's golden age of political nonsense. Kings were still pretending divine right was a real thing. Revolutions were brewing in coffee houses, and wigs were so enormous they needed their own footmen. Silence in that world was rebellion, and Charles's silence became something of a quiet protest. His court split into two factions, the more pragmatics, who believed the Duke's silence was strategic genius, a kind of enlightened stoicism, and the panic-stricken, who thought he was simply broken. Both were wrong, of course. Charles wasn't wise, and he wasn't mad. He was just tired. Tired of the endless chatter of courtiers, the fawning, the politics disguised as friendship. So he stopped participating. His household adjusted, as households tend to do when their boss goes silent. The servants learned to read his body language like scripture. A raised eyebrow meant yes. A slow blink meant no. A sigh meant please leave. The palace steward even created a small manual titled The Duke's Expressions and Their Probable Meanings, which circulated secretly among staff. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it worked well enough. And because Charles refused to speak, everyone else started speaking less too. The palace grew quieter with each passing year, until it became a kind of living monastery of nobility. Visitors were asked to whisper. The clocks were muffled. Even the dogs somehow barked softly. Imagine that, an entire ducal court moving at half volume, afraid to disturb the air. His mother, the Duchess Dowager, tried to fix him, as mothers often do. She invited philosophers, doctors, even a few mystics. None succeeded, one particularly. Confident physician prescribed conversation therapy, which consisted of sitting across from the Duke and reciting increasingly exciting stories until he responded. The doctor lasted 3 days before giving up and writing. Patient displays the emotional response of a glacier. Another attempt involved music. The court orchestra performed nightly under his balcony. He listened quietly for weeks, then sent down a single note. Too much trumpet, that was all. Then came Amalia von Grunewald. Yes, that Amalia, the same widow from our last story. Because as it turns out, history likes to recycle its side characters. By this time, Amalia was in her 40s, still graceful, still elegantly bored, and now the unofficial hostess of every mildly interesting salon in southern Germany. When she heard rumors about a duke who didn't speak, she naturally had to see for herself. She arrived unannounced in a gray carriage lined with lavender silk and demanded an audience. The chamberlain tried to warn her, "The Duke does not converse," she smiled. "Neither do I." When she entered the audience chamber, Charles was sitting in his usual position, slightly slouched. Hands folded, gaze distant, Amalia curtsied, then sat down without waiting to be invited. They stared at each other for a solid minute, then two. Finally, she said softly, "You must find it exhausting. All these people wanting you to be interesting." He blinked slowly, which according to the steward's manual meant agreement. She smiled faintly. "Good. Then I won't ask you to be." And with that, she took out a small stone, smooth white, and placed it on the table. "I brought this from the Rhine," she said, "for an old friend." Something flickered in Charles's eyes. Recognition? Maybe. Maybe not. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his palm, and nodded once. No words were exchanged. None were needed. After that, Amalia visited often. They'd sit in silence, sipping tea, occasionally exchanging small gestures, A raised brow, a glance toward the window, a shared sigh when the weather turned dreary. For the first time in years, the Duke seemed peaceful, the servants noticed. He began walking again, just short distances, through the overgrown gardens he'd once ordered left wild. Birds nested in the hedges. Flowers grew between marble cracks. When asked by an advisor if he wanted the grounds restored, he simply wrote, "No. Let the chaos breathe." The French Revolution erupted in 1789, sending waves of panic through Europe. Neighboring rulers tightened control, burned pamphlets, imprisoned anyone who even thought about liberty. Charles did nothing. When his advisors asked for a statement condemning the revolution, he shrugged. When France declared war on the German states, he still said nothing. And when his ministers begged him to raise an army, he wrote only, "War is loud." They raised it anyway. He didn't stop them. He just withdrew further into his silent world. In 1793, during a harsh winter, the Duke fell ill. Pneumonia, probably, though the court physicians tried to dress it up with Latin. He refused medicine, refused priests, refused to speak even once in his final weeks. Amalia came to see him, older now, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted his blanket. "You'll have to say something eventually," she murmured. "Even if it's just goodbye." He looked at her for a long time. Then finally spoke, his first words in over a decade. "I've been saying it," he whispered, just very quietly. Then he smiled, faint, like candlelight before it goes out. And that was it. The silent Duke was gone. After his death, the palace remained quiet for months, as if no one quite dared to raise their voice. His successor, a distant cousin with a fondness for speeches, immediately ordered renovations. The gardens were trimmed, the clocks unmuffled, the orchestra brought back with extra trumpets. And within a few years, the silence that had defined the court was gone, replaced by the usual chatter of politics and polite insincerity. Only one thing remained untouched, a small, white stone on the Duke's desk. No one knew where it came from, but Amalia did. She took it back to her estate and placed it beside another stone, older, smoother, the one Mister Pebble had once carried in his pocket. She never explained the connection. Maybe she didn't need to. So that was Charles of Württemberg, a man who ruled not with decrees or armies, but with absence, who turned silence into a form of resistance. Maybe he wasn't a great ruler, but he was in his own way a reminder that sometimes saying nothing can echo louder than all the speeches in the world. Now, breathe. Let the quiet settle in. Because next, we'll drift to someone who believed the exact opposite. A ruler who couldn't stop talking, and whose endless words nearly destroyed him. So, get comfortable. Take a sip of something warm. Take a sip of something warm. All right, still awake? Barely? Perfect, because after Mr. Pebble and the silent Duke, two men who made history. By barely participating in it, it's time to meet someone who tried to do the exact opposite. Someone who thought words could fix everything. Spoiler, they couldn't. Tonight, we're paying a late-night visit to King Christian VII of Denmark, a man whose mouth ran faster than his mind ever could. Christian was born in 1749, into that typical royal soup of powdered faces and parental indifference. His father, King Frederick V, was a cheerful drunk who treated governance like a part-time hobby. His mother, Queen Louise of Great Britain, was kind but perpetually ill. And by ill, the doctors of the time meant alive but inconvenient. Christian was their first son, the heir, the hope of Denmark, the tiny, fragile, slightly twitchy bundle who would someday wear the crown. Unfortunately, no one told Christian he was supposed to act like a king. As a child, he was described, diplomatically, as nervously imaginative, which is 18th century noble speak for, "This kid never stops talking. He'd chatter for hours to anyone who'd listen, to servants, to portraits, to passing dogs, sometimes even to chairs." One tutor wrote, "His Majesty in training speaks as though silence were a crime punishable by boredom." The court physicians prescribed all kinds of useless treatments: leeches, mercury tonics, even horseback conversation therapy, which, yes, was just shouting about your feelings while riding a horse. Nothing worked. He kept talking. When his father died in 1766, Christian ascended the throne at 17, a teenager in a powdered wig and too much responsibility. The coronation went beautifully, until it didn't. Halfway through the ceremony, while the bishop was reciting the sacred oath, Christian interrupted, loudly. He started commenting on the bishop's accent, then on the acoustics of the church, then on how heavy his own robes were. The court tried to laugh it off as youthful nerves, but the mood was tense. One observer wrote, "His Majesty displayed a lively wit, unfortunately unaccompanied by timing." And that pretty much summed up his reign. Christian loved talking, but hated listening. He'd call his ministers in for urgent meetings, make them sit in stiff chairs for hours, then ramble endlessly about whatever popped into his mind. Theater, gardening, the moral character of ducks, you name it. He'd pace around the room, gesturing wildly, sometimes laughing at his own thoughts, while the ministers sat frozen in polite agony. If anyone tried to speak, he'd wave them off. Yes, yes, I know, he'd say, except he didn't. He was also obsessed with being liked. He wanted to be known as the people's king, approachable, funny, charming, so he'd sneak out of the palace at night to mingle with commoners, which sounds wholesome until you remember this was the 18th century. And mingling often involved drunken taverns and questionable company. His handlers tried to keep him under control, but Christian had one fatal flaw. He believed his own conversations were genius. He'd ramble on about philosophy to anyone nearby, guards, servants, even startled gardeners. He'd quote Voltaire one minute and make chicken noises the next. One poor court musician recorded in his diary, "The king spoke for 4 hours today. I am certain none of us will ever hear silence again." At some point, his advisors realized that letting him talk in public was becoming a national embarrassment. So they tried to limit his appearances, fewer speeches, shorter ceremonies, no unsupervised conversations with ambassadors. That lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days. On the 4th day, Christian wandered into a council meeting, announced that he was bored, and decided to personally rewrite Denmark's entire tax code. Out loud, it took 6 hours. Nothing changed. Now, beneath all the talking, there was something sad, something off. Christian wasn't just energetic, and he was unstable. Suffered from what doctors at the time called melancholic excitement, a charming euphemism for what modern psychiatry would probably diagnose as severe mental illness. He'd swing from euphoric chatter to sudden despair, sometimes mid-sentence. He'd laugh uncontrollably, then fall silent, trembling. At one point, he became convinced that mirrors were conspiring against him. He ordered every reflective surface in the palace covered, except one, which he claimed was on his side. He also developed strange habits. He'd slap people randomly, laugh, apologize, then do it again. He'd dress up as a servant and wait on his own guests, just to see their reactions. And of course, he'd talk. Always talk. His marriage didn't help. In 1766, he was wed to Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, his cousin, naturally. Because that's how royals operated. The family tree was more like a family pretzel. Caroline was 15, shy, intelligent, and utterly unprepared for a husband who never stopped monologuing about philosophical ducks. During their wedding feast, he spent most of the evening talking to the musicians instead of her. At one point, he congratulated himself out loud for being a very good husband already. He wasn't. Within months, he lost interest in her entirely and took up with a string of mistresses, drinking companions, and court jesters who encouraged his erratic behavior. By 1768, his court was less a royal household and more a 24-hour improv theater. Starring one deeply unwell king, enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the only man who ever managed to make Christian's words mean something. Struensee was a German doctor, rational, charming, and annoyingly competent. He was hired originally as Christian's personal physician, but quickly became his confidant, or, more accurately, his translator. He listened to the king's endless ramblings, nodded patiently, and somehow managed to extract usable policy ideas from them. When Christian blurted out, "Everyone should just be free," during one sleepless night, Struensee turned it into a real reform, abolishing torture, improving education, even pushing for freedom of the press. It was the Enlightenment, distilled through a man who couldn't stop talking long enough to realize he'd inspired it. For a while, things got better. Christian, feeling heard, calmed down. His monologues softened into long, dreamy conversations with Struensee about reason, progress, and whether dogs had souls. Struensee, meanwhile, became the de facto ruler of Denmark. He issued decrees in the king's name, reorganized the government, and, in a classic royal subplot twist, began an affair with Queen Caroline. Yes, the king's wife. Now, you might expect a dramatic confrontation here. But remember, this is a sleepy history story, not a Netflix show. Christian didn't rage. He didn't even seem to notice. When told about the affair, he shrugged and said, "Oh, well, they do talk a lot," which might be the most unintentionally poetic line in Danish history, but not everyone found it poetic. The conservative nobles hated Struensee's reforms. They saw him as an outsider manipulating their unstable monarch, which, to be fair, he was, so they plotted. Quietly, of course, because loud plotting gets you executed. In 1772, while Christian was distracted by a long conversation with his reflection, which he claimed was finally being reasonable, the conspirators struck. Struensee was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Caroline was exiled. Christian was declared unfit to rule, which was an understatement, and placed under permanent supervision, and the talking stopped. For the rest of his life, the once constant stream of words slowed to a trickle. He'd sit by the window for hours, whispering to himself. Not the lively chatter of youth, but quiet fragments, unfinished thoughts. Apologies no one understood. Visitors described him as a man who has used up all his words. He lived like that for 2 decades, wandering the corridors of his palace, humming under his breath, occasionally murmuring to imaginary companions. He died in 1808, at the age of 59 after a long, slow decline. And when they went through his belongings, they found stacks of papers filled with scribbles, half-sentences, doodles, the word "listen" written dozens of times. So that was King Christian VII, a man who tried to fill the silence with words, and ended up drowning in them. He wasn't evil, just human, painfully, audibly human. The kind of person who needed to be heard so badly that he forgot how to be understood. And maybe that's the saddest kind of noise there is. Now, let's breathe again, loosen your shoulders, because next, we'll glide away from the chatter and into something stranger. A queen whose beauty was legendary, but whose life was quietly tragic in the slowest possible way. She was adored, painted endlessly, and forgotten almost as quickly. So fluff your pillow. We're staying sleepy. But with a hint of melancholy glamour next, so by now, we've firmly established that Mister Pebble, whose real name may or may not have been Ambrose Fitzherbert, depending on how charitable you are with census records, wasn't exactly what you'd call a mover and shaker. He was more of a sitter and mutterer. But as the village of Winthrop Vale began to hum with the slow, inevitable passage of time, which, as we all know, is the world's most boring metronome, Pebble began to attract the attention of a few other equally aimless souls. One of them was a painter named Edmund Tallow. And Edmund, bless his heart, was the sort of man who could make beige sound overstimulating. He painted landscapes so lifeless that critics joked he was secretly documenting the afterlife. Still, he was fascinated by Pebble. Something about a man who could spend an entire hour staring at a mossy stone seemed to him the pinnacle of artistic inspiration. So Edmund began to follow Pebble, discreetly, of course on his evening walks, which, to be fair, wasn't hard, because Pebble's walk was less of a journey and more of a deliberate shuffle between minor landmarks. The lichen-covered bridge, the crooked willow, the bench that had given up being a bench somewhere around 1884. And there he'd pause, breathe through his nose like a man conducting internal negotiations, and then continue onward, as though fulfilling an ancient ritual known only to himself. Edmund eventually decided to paint him. Not once, but 7 times. Each canvas was labeled simply "Man in Twilight," and each looked identical, a dim figure mid-walk, swallowed by fog. When asked why he kept painting the same subject, Edmund shrugged and said, "He never finishes his walk. Why should I finish mine?" And that really was the ethos of Winthrop Vale. Everyone there seemed suspended between beginnings and endings, half-baked projects, incomplete renovations, and lifelong daydreams about moving somewhere slightly more lively. But no one ever did. Pebble, however, seemed perfectly content to drift through it all. The villagers had started to weave stories about him now. Some said he was once an aristocrat who'd gone mad after losing his fortune. Others whispered that he was waiting for someone, perhaps a lost love, or a ghost, or the postman who never came. None of it was true, of course. But the human mind abhors a vacuum, and Pebble's life was an enormous echoing one. Let's drift over to another evening, the kind where the air feels like it's been sitting out too long. Pebble is walking again, hat slightly askew, his steps rhythmically slow. The moon hangs low and rather bored-looking itself, spilling pale light over the cobblestones. Edmund, a few paces behind, sketches in silence. And from one of the nearby windows a curtain moves. Behind it, Miss Clara Pennington, spinster, amateur theosophist, and professional collector of unusual gossip, watches them both. She has decided that Pebble is attuned to vibrations, which sounds spiritual, but in Clara's case, it really just means she thought he had good posture. Clara, you see, was the kind of person who read too many mystic pamphlets and not enough common sense. She once held a séance to contact the spirit of her still-living aunt, which caused a minor scandal and a broken teacup. But she believed firmly that Pebble was not merely walking, he was aligning, with what exactly no one knew. And so, as tends to happen in quiet places with too much moonlight and too little entertainment, rumors grew. By the time winter came around, Pebble had somehow become the subject of a small cult of curiosity. Villagers began to follow his path during the day, tracing his habitual route as though it might reveal cosmic wisdom. Spoiler, it didn't. The only thing most people discovered was that his secret grove was really just a spot where the hedgerow gave up and let the mud win. Still, people needed something to romanticize when the village clock tower collapsed, slowly, as though embarrassed about it. Pebble was the first to stand beside the rubble, watching quietly. Someone claimed they saw him tip his hat. The next day, Clara declared that he was mourning the passage of time, which was impressive, given that she could barely mourn the passage of her soup course. It's worth noting here that Pebble never contradicted anyone's theories about him. He didn't encourage them, but he didn't deny them either. He simply continued walking, as though everyone else was a particularly persistent breeze. And that, oddly enough, made him fascinating. Because in a world addicted to explanations, Mr. Pebble offered none. No speeches, no revelations, no tragic diary entries discovered posthumously. Just walks, endless, quiet, circular walks through a village that mistook his stillness for depth. One night, Edmund, the painter, finally approached him. He'd finished what he called his final Pebble painting, which looked remarkably like all the others, only slightly sadder. "Do you ever tire of walking?" he asked. Pebble looked up at the stars, then back at Edmund, and said, so softly it nearly dissolved in the night air, "No, the ground keeps changing." It wasn't profound. It wasn't even strictly true. But Edmund, of course, interpreted it as poetic genius. Within a week, he'd written a 20-page essay titled "The Metaphysics of Motion in Mister Pebble." It was unreadable, and so Pebble's myth continued to grow. People began to send letters to him, folded neatly and left under the willow tree where he sometimes paused. Messages like, "Please tell me what to do with my life," or "Is my husband in heaven?" Or once simply, "Do you ever get bored?" No one ever saw him pick them up. But sometimes they disappeared. Now, before you start imagining anything too whimsical, let's remember that this is Winthrop Vale, where even miracles are mildly inconvenient. The likelier explanation is that the wind, or perhaps the occasional stray dog, took them. But for those who needed meaning, Pebble provided a convenient blank canvas. He was, in a way, the quiet conscience of the village. A reminder that stillness, however pointless, had its own kind of dignity. As winter melted into another forgettable spring, Pebble continued his slow circuits, hat slightly more battered, steps slightly shorter. Edmund's paintings gathered dust in a local shop window, unbought but frequently stared at by people who wanted to feel profound for a few minutes. Clara began hosting alignment walks, which mostly involved strolling very slowly while pretending to think deeply about moss, and the world, as it tends to do, moved on around them. Some said Pebble died that year. Others said he simply walked a little farther than usual and didn't come back. The truth, like most things about him, was neither clear nor especially important, because whether he was a mystic, a lunatic, or just a man who preferred gravel to people, Mr. Pebble left exactly the kind of legacy he probably wanted, one that went absolutely nowhere very quietly. So, let's sink gently, like a slightly overripe pear, into the decades after Mr. Pebble's quiet disappearance. He had walked out of the story, and the story refused to admit it. You see, small English villages have a peculiar way of embalming their oddities. When someone like Pebble drifts away, he doesn't vanish, he ferments into folklore. It's like emotional composting, and Winthrop Vale, being the sort of place where even gossip took its time, began to preserve Pebble's memory in a syrup of dreamy exaggeration. The first rumor that took root came naturally from Miss Clara Pennington. She had by then reached the age where everything she said sounded like a seance. She declared to her tea circle that Pebble had transcended the material plane, which, coming from Clara, could mean anything from he died to he went to visit his sister in Devon. But her phrasing stuck, transcended. It sounded comforting, almost flattering. The villagers began to speak of Pebble not as gone, but as having continued his walk elsewhere, which, for Winthrop Vale, was probably the most poetic thing anyone had said in living memory. Years passed. The painter Edmund Tallow moved to Bath, where his Man in Twilight series was exhibited once, by accident, after being mistaken for fog studies. He died content, which is to say he died mid-sentence, during a lecture about shadows of the soul. His last words were reportedly, "I think he's still walking." And that's how it began, the legend of the Endless Walker. Children, who never met Pebble but somehow felt they had, would whisper that if you stayed very still on the bridge at dusk, you could hear soft footsteps on the gravel, not haunting, not heavy, just patient. Some said he appeared as a faint shimmer, like the air itself had remembered how to move. Others insisted he left behind small piles of pebbles, arranged neatly as though marking his invisible route. Of course, every generation adds a bit of seasoning to its myths. By the 1920s, Pebble was no longer a mild-mannered wanderer, but a sort of ghostly guardian, half saint, half urban legend. If your crops grew well, you thanked the walker. If they failed, you muttered that perhaps you disrespected the path. One farmer even started leaving out small offerings: bread, milk, and once disastrously a piece of sausage roll. His fields remained exactly the same, but his reputation improved immensely. People said he was attuned. By the 1950s, when the outside world was roaring through its industrial adolescence, Winthrop Vale stayed stubbornly drowsy. Tourists occasionally arrived, drawn by an article in some regional magazine titled England's Sleepiest Mysteries. They came expecting chills, seances, or at least an atmospheric pub. What they found instead was a muddy lane, a tired bridge, and a sign that said, "The Pebble Walk." "Please tread quietly." A few took photographs. A few more complained about the lack of amenities. One woman declared the place had a beautiful nothingness, which really summed it up. The village, in turn, capitalized on this mild curiosity. They printed postcards with Edmund Tallow's foggy paintings and sold them for 6 pence apiece. There was even talk of building a small statue of Pebble, but of course no one could agree on what he'd looked like. Some said tall, some said bent. Some swore he always carried a walking stick. Others insisted his only accessory was melancholy, so the statue was never built. Instead, they placed a simple stone bench where the old willow once stood. On it, a brass plaque read, "He walked," and that was enough. It was perhaps the most accidentally profound sentence in village history. Now, if we zoom out a little, we can see what was really happening. Pebble wasn't just a man anymore. He was a mirror. The villagers saw in him what they wanted to see: peace, patience, mystery, or just an excuse to feel connected to something vaguely meaningful without having to change their routine. And honestly, can you blame them? In a world that kept getting faster, louder, and busier, Pebble represented the ultimate rebellion, doing absolutely nothing, with quiet conviction. But legends, like ivy, creep in directions no one expects. By the 1970s, a small academic paper appeared, written by a Dr. Lionel Graves, a folklorist at Cambridge. He had spent a summer in Winthrop Vale interviewing locals and drinking enough weak tea to dissolve his will to live. His paper was titled, "The Persistent Echo, Post-Victorian Local Saints in Rural England." He dedicated an entire chapter to Pebble. In it, he suggested that Pebble represented the subconscious English yearning for inertia, which frankly was spot on. He wrote, "Where continental Europe dreams of revolution and America dreams of motion, England dreams of standing perfectly still." It was the kind of sentence that made academics nod sagely over biscuits. Dr. Graves even proposed that Pebble's route, a rough circular loop through the village and back again, symbolized the futility of progress. Which sounds clever, but in truth, Pebble probably just didn't like walking uphill. Still, that's the funny thing about myth. The less you know, the more people will invent on your behalf. Soon, every generation of Winthrop Vale residents had their own version of the walker. For some, he was a kindly ghost. For others, he was a timeless observer of human folly. And for a few particularly imaginative locals, he was a literal elemental being, a spirit of stone and memory. Which sounds dramatic until you realize this spirit mostly hung out near drainage ditches. By the 1990s, local historians had begun including Pebble in walking tours, sandwiched awkwardly between a 14th century barn and the story of a pig that once escaped from the fair and caused traffic on the A47. One guide described Pebble as a man who transcended purpose. Another, clearly bored, said, "He was sort of local." The visitors nodded, as tourists do when they've come too far to admit they're disappointed. But here's the lovely thing about Mr. Pebble. His legend, in its small, unassuming way, endured. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was mysterious, but because it was comforting. Every person who heard of him, every tired commuter or stressed-out visitor could picture him. Quiet, deliberate, unbothered by the world's chaos. He didn't seek meaning. He didn't chase destiny. He just walked. And in a strange, sleepy way, that became a kind of wisdom. Sometimes, especially on foggy evenings when the wind carries that faint whisper of gravel underfoot, people still pause at the edge of the path. They look into the mist and imagine the faintest outline, a hat, a shadow, a calm presence moving steadily onward, and they think maybe that it's all right not to rush, that life doesn't have to be a grand journey, that sometimes it's perfectly fine to just walk nowhere in particular. Because Mr. Pebble's walk never really ended. It just slowed down until it matched the heartbeat of the place itself, and if you listen long enough and quietly enough, you might hear it too. So, let's stretch our legs, or not, in Pebbles, honor, and wander into the 21st century, where legends like him find new afterlives in the least mystical place imaginable, the internet. Because of course they do. Everything eventually ends up there. Cats, conspiracies, old sandwich reviews. It was only a matter of time before Mr. Pebble joined the digital chorus of half-remembered ghosts. The story began, as most modern folklore now does, with a blurry photograph. It appeared one misty morning on a local Facebook group called Winthrop Vale Then and Now, posted by someone named Sandra with a Soul. The photo showed an empty country lane, nothing remarkable, except for a faint, elongated shadow near the bend in the road. Sandra captioned it, "Took this near the old bridge yesterday evening. Doesn't it look like someone walking?" It got 17 likes and one angry comment from a man named Clive who claimed it was clearly a smudge. But the damage, or perhaps the magic, was done. Within days, the comments section filled with quiet nostalgia. People began sharing old family stories about the walker. "My Nan used to tell us never to whistle on the pebble path after dark," one said. Another claimed her grandfather had once followed the sound of footsteps for miles before realizing it was just his own shoes. Still, the myth had logged in. Then came TikTok. Because naturally, a local teenager with an eye for moody filters and lo-fi music posted a short video titled, "I Tried to Find the Winthrop Walker." It was all soft fog, slow pans, and the kind of eerie stillness that makes your brain whisper, "Maybe something's there." The video ended with the words, "He walked, and that was enough." Within a week, it had 2 million views. Comments poured in. "This feels peaceful, not scary. Honestly, I want to be like him. Just walking, no purpose, no stress, low-key relatable ghost." And thus Mr. Pebble became the most unintentionally wholesome haunting in internet history. People began editing his image, turning him into minimalist art, ASMR scripts, even a short meditation loop titled "Walk with Pebble, 10 minutes of mindful wandering." It was all very gentle. No jump scares, no drama. Just an imagined figure drifting through the mist like a calming screensaver for the soul. The villagers of Winthrop Vale, most of whom still thought Wi-Fi was a type of biscuit, were bemused. The parish council briefly discussed whether to brand the legend for tourism. Someone suggested selling Pebble Path tea. Someone else suggested a walking festival, though the irony was lost on no one. But it wasn't just marketing. The legend had quietly evolved. Mr. Pebble was no longer merely a quaint ghost story or local curiosity. Online, he became a symbol of something the modern world had almost forgotten: slowness. TikTokers began calling it the Pebble mindset. You can probably picture it now: pastel text, a soft piano track, and an aesthetic listicle about embracing aimlessness. "Walk slowly," it read. "Speak softly. Expect nothing. Become Pebble." It sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But also kind of beautiful. Because beneath the hashtags and filters, something real was happening. People were tired, burned out, chronically overstimulated by lives that demanded constant purpose. And here was this ancient, obscure English man, long dead, possibly imaginary, who represented the opposite. He wasn't ambitious. He wasn't productive. He wasn't hustling. He was just walking, calmly, perpetually, and somehow that became revolutionary. Reddit threads appeared, analyzing him like a Zen koan. One popular post titled, "Did Mr. Pebble actually exist?" gathered hundreds of sleepy comments debating whether he was a metaphor for death, time, or just existential boredom in tweed. One user wrote, "Maybe Pebble isn't real, maybe he's what happens when a village dreams too long," which is possibly the most poetic sentence ever written by someone with an anime profile picture. Even YouTube got involved. Documentary-style channels with names like Unsolved But Cozy or Haunted But Polite produced videos about him, complete with droning ambient music and slow narration. Titles like The Man Who Walked Forever, England's Softest Legend, The Ghost Who Forgot to Leave, Mister Pebble and the Art of Gentle Nothing. Each video followed the same rhythm. A slow zoom on foggy countryside, a half-whispered recounting of his story, and a closing line reminding viewers to take it slow. In a sense, Pebble had finally gone global. His face, well, approximation of a face, since no one knew what he looked like, appeared on enamel pins, stickers, and minimalist tattoos. A quiet silhouette in mid-stride, hat tipped low, sometimes accompanied by the phrase, "He walked." And that was enough. It became something of a mantra for people craving rest in a world that never shuts up. And honestly, that's where the irony deepens. Because Mister Pebble, who in life was ignored, misunderstood, and profoundly ordinary, became, centuries later, a soft-spoken prophet of calm. He didn't ask for followers. He didn't ask for meaning, but meaning found him anyway, centuries too late, and through algorithms he couldn't possibly imagine. One of the stranger developments came from a small online community that began holding Pebble Walks once a month. Participants would meet, virtually or in person, and walk slowly, without phones, without music, without purpose. Just walking, somewhere between meditation and mild confusion. They'd post afterward about the experience. I walked for 30 minutes and didn't check my watch once. I think I heard the sound of my own thoughts for the first time in months. And yes, it's easy to roll your eyes. But isn't it also oddly soothing? Because somewhere in all that irony, the spirit of Mister Pebble survived. Not as a ghost, but as a quiet reminder. That slowness has value. That stillness is not the same as stagnation. That life, walked at half speed, might actually feel more like living. Today, if you search his name online, you'll find an eclectic mix. Wikipedia entries, local myths, ASMR, videos, digital art, and think pieces on the philosophy of Pebble. And buried somewhere in all that noise, there's still the original heart of it. A simple story about a man who walked. Maybe he existed, maybe not. But he's still walking. In our feeds, our playlists, our sleepy thoughts at 2 a.m. when the world finally shuts up enough to breathe. Because Mister Pebble never stopped, he just changed paths. Now, as the fog of history settles again and the sound of gravel fades into the hush of night, perhaps it's best to let him go on walking, quietly, endlessly, peacefully. All right, let's settle in, slower this time. The lights dimmed, blankets tucked just so, the kind of quiet where even your thoughts whisper. We're drifting into the final stretch of Mister Pebble's long, wandering story. A story now less about history, more about the soft, timeless rhythm of being. After centuries of walking, after myths and digital resurrection, Mister Pebble exists in a curious place between reality and imagination. He is not a ghost, exactly, nor is he simply a man who once shuffled through a village. He is the echo of all quiet evenings, the kind that stretch just long enough for the mind to sigh and the body to relax. Imagine it. A gentle lane, half hidden by fog, lined with trees whose branches bend toward each other as though sharing secrets. Somewhere far off, a crow caws, but softly, like it doesn't want to wake anyone. Pebble's shadow moves through the mist, slow, unhurried, deliberate. Every step lands with the soft authority of a thought that has nothing urgent to say. In the centuries since, Winthrop Vale has changed. Pavements replaced cobblestones, streetlights replaced lanterns. The villagers now speak in the brisk, hurried tones of modern life. But the paths of Mister Pebble remain, overgrown, quiet, and oddly sacred in their simplicity. The moss has returned. The willow bends, patient as ever. Gravel still whispers underfoot. People who come now rarely see him. Sometimes they do. A flash of a hat, the faint shuffle of shoes, or a shadow at dusk. And then he's gone. But the sensation lingers, like the echo of a calm sigh in a too loud world. And perhaps that is the true magic of Mr. Pebble. He teaches not through spectacle, nor through words, nor through deeds recorded in dusty archives. He teaches through absence, through the quiet insistence that some things, slowness, patience, stillness, have worth in themselves. Some children, the rare, perceptive ones, leave little notes under the willow tree. Messages like, "I hope you're still walking." "Did you see the sunset tonight? Thank you for reminding me to breathe." No one ever knows if Pebble reads them or if they simply vanish into the soil. And perhaps that is the point. The value lies not in response, but in the act itself. A small, quiet ritual of recognition, the acknowledgement of presence in the infinite calm of the evening. Over time, the myth gently folds back into the village's collective memory. School children learn of him not as a historical figure, but as a lesson. Sometimes doing nothing is enough. Sitting, walking, being, observing. The rhythm of life slowed to match that of the earth beneath your feet. Even scholars now, when they write about Winthrop Vale, mention Pebble only in footnotes, almost apologetically. A wandering figure, a local curiosity, the man who inspired centuries of reflection without ever saying a word. Yet at twilight, if you are still enough, you can almost hear him. A soft shuffle on gravel, a faint murmur of wind through the willow, a reminder that in a world addicted to progress, noise, and constant movement, it is permissible, sometimes even necessary, to simply walk, slowly, quietly, aimlessly. And maybe, just maybe, if you let your mind drift as gently as Pebble's steps, you can join him. For a while at least. No rush, no purpose, no urgency, just the slow cadence of your own heartbeat and the soft promise of another evening to follow. Mr. Pebble's story, in the end, is not about a man at all. It is about the spaces between action and thought, the gentle pauses that allow life to breathe. It is the art of patience, the discipline of calm, and the quiet revolution of doing very little, but feeling entirely the world around you. And so, as night deepens, let your thoughts drift. Let your body sink into warmth. Let the story of Mr. Pebble, walking forever in twilight, guide you into a sleep that is slow, gentle, and endlessly patient. He walks. And that, my friends, is more than enough.